The courthouse that morning carried a strange kind of silence, the kind that does not come from peace, but from routine arrogance that nobody has challenged for too long. And inside that silence, Sergeant Daniel Mercer stood near the entrance like he owned the entire building, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp in a way that always made civilians uncomfortable. Because Mercer didn't just enforce law, he performed authority as if it was a personal identity. And that morning, he was already irritated before anything even happened because the shift was slow, paperwork was piling, and in his mind, nothing interesting ever came from people who walked too slowly through courthouse doors. But then a black government-issued SUV pulled up outside the courthouse steps, and a woman stepped out. And something about her immediately caught his attention, not because she looked threatening, but because she looked too calm, too controlled, too composed for someone entering his space. And she wore a simple dark blazer, no visible aggression, no panic, no hesitation, just steady steps like she already knew exactly where she was going. And as she approached the courthouse entrance, Mercer stepped forward without thinking, blocking her path before she could even reach the door. And he looked her up and down slowly in front of everyone like he was measuring her worth in silence before speaking, and then he said the words he had used countless times before with civilians who didn't immediately submit to his presence, asking in a cold, dismissive tone what she thought she was doing here and whether she understood that places like this had rules. And behind him, another officer chuckled lightly as if this was entertainment, and the woman did not respond immediately. She simply stopped, looked at him directly without fear, and said she was here for a scheduled legal matter and needed access to the courthouse. But Mercer raised his hand again, stopping her from moving forward, and demanded identification in a louder, sharper tone, designed not just to question her, but to embarrass her in front of others. And when she calmly reached into her folder to comply, he suddenly slapped the entire file out of her hands without warning, and papers scattered across the courthouse entrance steps like they meant nothing. And a few civilians gasped, but nobody stepped in because authority always creates hesitation in crowds. And Mercer leaned slightly closer, saying he deals with people like her every day who pretend to be important when they are not. And the woman slowly bent down without anger or reaction and began collecting her documents one by one with controlled precision, and that silence should have been the end of it for Mercer. Another routine interaction he would forget by lunch, but what he didn't realize was that every second of that encounter had already been recorded by multiple courthouse surveillance systems, with synchronized backup feeds being stored on federal servers outside his jurisdiction. And the woman he had just insulted was not reacting because she was analyzing everything: camera placement, officer positioning, procedural violations, timing of escalation, tone of command, and behavioral patterns, because she was not a random civilian at all. And inside her leather folder were not personal documents, but federal authorization papers that most officers in that building would never be cleared to view. And Mercer, unaware of any of this, finally stepped aside with a dismissive comment telling her to remember her place as she walked past him without turning back. And for him, that moment ended there. But for her, it was only the beginning of a full system observation. And inside the courthouse, she noticed something unusual: her name already appearing on an internal restricted review board listing connected to courtroom 3, which confirmed that this was not a random visit but part of a pre-flagged oversight case. And while Mercer returned to his usual mindset, believing he had just controlled another situation, the internal courthouse system had already flagged his behavior for review under federal monitoring protocol without his knowledge, and later that same morning, Mercer entered courtroom 3 for an unrelated misconduct hearing, acting completely confident, adjusting his uniform, believing nothing from earlier mattered anymore. And when proceedings began, he gave testimony as a routine officer, describing standard enforcement actions and suspicious civilian behavior in a calm, rehearsed tone that made him feel in control, while other officers nodded behind him, reinforcing his version of reality. And at that moment, the woman from earlier was called to speak, and she stood up slowly and walked toward the witness stand without any change in expression. And only then did Mercer actually look at her properly for the first time inside the courtroom, and something in his expression flickered for half a second before he covered it with arrogance, assuming she was just another complainant. But when she spoke, her voice was calm and precise, and she requested immediate preservation of all courthouse exterior surveillance footage between exact timestamps. And that specific request immediately shifted the energy in the courtroom because it was too accurate to be random, and Mercer scoffed under his breath, calling it a distraction tactic. But she turned toward him and asked in a quiet, controlled voice, if he remembered slapping her file out of her hands before she even entered the courthouse. And that single sentence changed everything, because now the courtroom understood this was not an assumption but a recorded accusation tied to a specific moment. And Mercer immediately tried to interrupt, denying it aggressively and calling it manipulation. But the woman calmly opened her leather folder and placed a sealed federal authorization document on the table. And the moment it became visible, the courtroom clerk froze because the header indicated Federal Oversight Enforcement Authority, and the judge leaned forward asking for verification. And within moments, the clerk confirmed her identity through official channels, and the entire atmosphere of the courtroom shifted because she was no longer a complainant. She was an active investigator, and when she requested full activation of surveillance playback and body cam synchronization logs, the judge approved immediately. And Mercer's confidence began to crack because approval meant irreversible evidence extraction. And seconds later, the courtroom screen lit up, showing the courthouse entrance footage, showing him blocking her path, insulting her, and slapping her file from her hands, and his own voice echoed through the room without edits or context removal. And the second officer's laughter was also clearly visible. And Mercer's expression changed completely because he was no longer in control of interpretation, and for the first time he looked around the courtroom, not as authority but as someone being evaluated, while the woman remained calm, watching the footage, not emotionally but clinically, as if confirming data she already possessed. And then she stated calmly that this was only the first layer of review, and that multiple synchronized angles had already been preserved on federal systems. And at that exact moment, the courtroom doors opened and federal agents entered with authority, confirming escalation of oversight jurisdiction. And Mercer stepped back slightly, realizing that this was no longer internal procedure but external enforcement. And the courtroom understood that what had just begun was not a simple misconduct case, but the start of a full structural investigation that would go far beyond one officer or one courthouse. The courtroom had already shifted into a completely different reality as federal agents stood inside the room confirming escalation of oversight authority, and Sergeant Mercer could feel something collapsing inside him that he had never prepared for, because in his entire career, he had always believed control came from presence, from uniform, from tone, from intimidation. But now none of that mattered because the footage was already on the screen and his own voice was already playing back without filters, without interpretation, without protection, and every second that passed was tightening the space around him as the courtroom stopped reacting emotionally and started observing, like a system finally waking up after years of silence. And the woman standing at the witness table remained completely calm, as if everything unfolding had already been calculated long before she entered this building, and now she simply watched the reaction phase begin. The federal agent at the front of the courtroom confirmed into his radio that full surveillance extraction had been completed and preserved on external servers under federal chain of custody protocol, which meant no officer inside the building could alter, delete, or challenge the evidence anymore. And that sentence alone caused Mercer's breathing to shift slightly, because for the first time he understood this was not a courtroom debate anymore. It was documentation already finalized beyond his reach. And the judge leaned forward, asking for expanded review of all related incidents tied to Officer Mercer's conduct logs, and within seconds the courtroom screen changed again as additional files began loading, showing prior flagged reports that had never reached court escalation, each one marked closed without review, each one labeled resolved without investigation, and the pattern forming across the screen made it clear this was not a single moment of misconduct, but a repeated behavioral structure that had been buried under administrative closure for years. Mercer tried to speak again, but his voice came out different now. Lower, less confident, as he said these were old cases already handled internally. But before he could continue, the woman interrupted calmly without raising her voice and said, "Internal handling without investigation is not resolution, it is containment." And that statement silenced the room in a way that felt heavier than any argument, because it reframed everything they were watching. And then she requested access to full courthouse officer interaction logs connected to entrance security and courtroom assignment history. And when the system complied, the screen displayed timestamps showing repeated encounters involving Mercer and multiple civilians across different days, with similar complaint patterns and similar behavioral responses. And suddenly, what looked like an isolated incident was now forming a documented pattern that could not be ignored anymore. A shift moved through the courtroom as officers seated behind Mercer started adjusting in their chairs, avoiding eye contact with him because they understood the direction this was going. And Mercer could feel that shift physically because isolation in a courtroom is different from isolation anywhere else. It happens in real time while people slowly detach themselves from your presence, and the woman finally turned slightly toward him for the first time since the footage began and said calmly that authority is not judged by how it is presented, but by how it behaves when no one is correcting it. And Mercer's jaw tightened because he realized she wasn't speaking emotionally, she was speaking structurally, like someone reading a report instead of arguing a case. The judge then ordered full departmental archive extraction related to Mercer's service history, and within moments the screen expanded again, showing internal notes, complaint summaries, supervisor remarks, and administrative decisions that had been made quietly over time. And the more the system loaded, the more the courtroom understood that warnings had existed long before this day, but none of them had ever reached accountability phase. And Mercer stepped slightly backward, now realizing for the first time that his badge was not protection inside this environment anymore. It was metadata. It was traceable behavior. It was a record being reconstructed in real time and not a shield. One of the federal agents moved closer to the judge and confirmed that Mercer's incident outside the courthouse had automatically triggered multi-layer review under federal oversight protocol due to simultaneous surveillance detection and public interaction flagging, and that meant everything he did had already been categorized as part of an active case. And Mercer suddenly turned his head toward the woman as if looking at her differently now, because only then did he understand she had not been randomly targeted or randomly present. She had been the trigger point of a system already watching. The courtroom screen then displayed enhanced synchronized footage combining multiple camera angles and audio feeds from the courthouse entrance, and the clarity of Mercer's voice as he made derogatory remarks echoed through the room again and again and again, reinforcing the same moment from different perspectives until it became undeniable, and the second officer, who had been laughing earlier, now stood completely still, avoiding any movement, as if stillness could disconnect him from accountability. And Mercer finally tried to speak loudly, saying this was being taken out of context, but the judge immediately interrupted, ordering silence and full continuation of evidence playback. The woman finally placed both hands on the table and said calmly that this investigation was not designed to interpret intent, but to review behavior and compliance, and that difference mattered because intention can be argued, but behavior is recorded. And at that exact moment, Mercer realized the most dangerous part of this entire situation was not the footage itself, but the fact that it was already accepted as final evidence without needing permission from him or anyone like him. Then the courtroom doors opened again and additional federal personnel entered carrying sealed case files, confirming expansion of jurisdiction beyond courthouse level into departmental oversight review and internal affairs audit activation. And Mercer's breathing changed again, because now this was no longer about defending a moment, it was about defending an entire history. And as he stood there realizing that everything he thought was isolated was actually connected, the woman simply closed her folder without emotion and said the final line that shifted the entire atmosphere permanently, that this case was not about one officer, but about a system that only becomes visible when someone records it correctly. And at that moment, Mercer finally understood what he had been facing from the very beginning: not a witness, not a complainant, not a civilian, but the beginning of accountability itself. And for the first time in his entire career, he was not the one controlling the environment, because the environment had already been documented without him noticing. The courtroom had now fully transformed into something that no longer resembled a routine legal proceeding, because every screen, every camera feed, every document being pulled from federal servers was building a single irreversible reality, and Sergeant Mercer was standing in the middle of it, realizing for the first time that authority was not something he owned. It was something that existed only as long as it was not examined too closely, and now everything about him was being examined in real time, and the woman standing at the witness table remained completely still, calm, and expressionless, as if the entire collapse of his world was nothing more than a scheduled process she had already seen 100 times before. The federal agents moved further into the courtroom, confirming full jurisdiction activation, while the judge requested final consolidation of all evidence, logs, and within seconds the screen expanded again, showing not just the courthouse entrance footage, but a connected timeline of Mercer's behavior patterns across multiple incidents, and what emerged was not a single mistake, but a structured repetition of similar interactions with civilians where authority had been used not as protection but as pressure, and the courtroom began to shift from shock into understanding because now the system itself was revealing what had previously been invisible. And Mercer tried one last time to speak, but his voice no longer carried weight in the room as the judge raised a hand and ordered silence while full review was finalized. The woman finally stepped slightly forward and spoke in the same calm tone she had maintained since the beginning, saying that accountability does not require emotion, only verification, and that statement landed heavier than anything else because it reframed everything in the room not as a personal conflict, but as procedural correction. And Mercer looked around, now realizing that nobody was defending him anymore, not because they hated him, but because the evidence had already separated truth from defense, and the second officer who had been beside him earlier was now avoiding eye contact entirely, as if distancing himself could undo recorded reality. Then the federal lead agent confirmed that Mercer's conduct file had triggered a full department-wide audit, and that additional officers linked to similar flagged interactions would now be reviewed under the same case. And at that moment, Mercer realized this was no longer about him alone, because the system was expanding outward and pulling everything connected into visibility, and the woman turned her head slightly toward him for the first time since the escalation began, and said quietly that systems do not collapse because of one event, they collapse because one event finally forces them to be seen, and Mercer felt something inside him break because he understood what she meant. The courtroom screen then displayed final synchronized footage compilation, merging all available angles of the courthouse entrance incident, and Mercer's voice played again, repeating the same disrespectful statements, but now layered with timestamps, metadata, and chain of custody verification, and there was no space left for interpretation anymore. And as the footage ended, the room remained silent for several seconds before the judge finally spoke, ordering immediate suspension of Mercer pending federal disciplinary action, and that sentence removed the last remaining structure he had been standing on, because suspension in this context was not temporary relief, it was the first formal step toward permanent accountability. Mercer finally turned his head toward the woman, as if expecting something from her, maybe anger, maybe satisfaction, maybe acknowledgement, but she gave none of those things, because for her this was not emotional victory, it was procedural completion, and that difference made it more powerful than anything else in the room. And the federal agents moved forward, signaling that custody procedures were being initiated, and Mercer did not resist, because by that point, resistance no longer had meaning inside a system that had already recorded everything. As he was escorted out of the courtroom, the atmosphere did not feel like celebration or punishment, it felt like correction, as if something that had been misaligned for a long time had finally been adjusted. And the woman closed her folder slowly and looked toward the judge, confirming that all required documentation had been submitted, and that oversight protocols were now active for continued review beyond this courtroom. And the judge nodded, acknowledging the formal transition of authority. Outside the courtroom, Mercer stopped for a moment as he was led down the hallway, and for the first time he saw himself not as an officer, not as authority, but as a recorded sequence of behavior. And that realization hit harder than any arrest, because it removed identity from ego and replaced it with evidence, and he finally understood that what he believed was power had actually been conditional all along. Back inside the courtroom, the silence remained for several seconds even after everything had ended, because everyone understood that what they had witnessed was not just one officer being held accountable, but a full system being forced to acknowledge what it had ignored. And the woman stood there for a moment longer before turning away and walking out the same way she entered, calm, steady, and completely unchanged, because she had not come to create chaos, she had come to activate truth. And once truth is activated, it does not require permission to continue existing. And as she disappeared through the courthouse doors, the final feeling left in the room was not fear or relief, but awareness that justice does not always arrive loudly or dramatically. Sometimes it arrives quietly in the form of documentation that can no longer be ignored, and once that happens, even the most confident authority has nowhere left to stand.